Let's take a look at some of the constraints. Imagine we wanted to create a users table once again. So we are going to use create table users. And right here, we want to define some of the columns, for example. So the first column is usually the ID. So we will say our ID has the type of integer. And after the data type, we can usually define some constraints. One of the constraints, for example, would be unsigned. And this is a constraint that you oftentimes use if you're working with integers. And if you think about a tiny int, for example, which as I explained already, tiny int. And as I explained already, tinyInt allows you to store the values from -127 to 128. So in total, essentially 256 numbers. So obviously, if we're working with IDs, for example, you don't really need negative numbers. And by saying unsigned, you say, okay, let's only use positive numbers. And by doing so by using unsigned, you can use numbers from 0 to 255. So essentially, again, 256 numbers. But now that we are focusing only on positive numbers, you can use a lot more positive numbers. And usually, obviously, you don't use a tiny int for IDs because you might have more than 256 users. So you are usually going with an int at least. So we are going to say int unsigned, for example, for the ID. Now let's also use auto underline increment as a keyword. And this, for example, means that the ID will be generated automatically by the database and it will auto increment automatically. So the first user that will be generated will get an ID of 1, the second one will get an ID of 2, the third one an ID of 3, and so on. And for the last row, we will say that we want to set this as a primary key. You don't need to understand that one right now, but just know that usually every table has a primary key to identify the table, and you can set that column by using the primary key keyword. Let's imagine we also want to use an email, for example, which could be a varchar of probably 255 characters. And now there's also the keyword not null, for example, that you can use to define that this column cannot be null. So there needs to be a value set inside of this column. We could also set a default value for this column by setting default. And you can set the default by just using quotation marks and saying, for example, hey@gmail.com. By doing so, you would set hey@gmail.com as a default if there's no value entered by the user, for example. Obviously, this does not really make too much sense for an email address, so you would just go ahead and use not null in this case. Unique might be something that you want to consider for an email though, because maybe you don't want two emails to be the exact same for an account. So if you think about Instagram, you usually use your email, for example, to sign up. And if two emails are the exact same, there would obviously be a problem with signing up two users with the same email. Now there also exists the check constraint. So let's imagine we have an age, which is, for example, an integer. This could, for example, also be a tiny int because we don't really need numbers higher than 255. So we could, for example, say this is a tiny int, it's unsigned. And we also want to check, for example, something. And by using check, you can use a condition, for example. So we could just check whether our age is greater or equal to 0, for example. So we make sure that our age is at least greater or equal to 0. For the email, you could, for example, also check. And then you could say email like, for example, so quotation marks, so %@%. And this percent essentially means there can be anything before the @ sign and there can be anything after the @ sign, but there needs to be an @ sign instead of the email. And this is something you don't need to remember yet, but you can also use a foreign key to link a different table to this table. So imagine you would have some comments, for example, in another table. Then you can say, for example, I want to link by using a foreign key those comments to a user's account, for example. Because obviously, if you think about a social media app, every user has comments, for example. But as I said, we're getting into that later on.